Please be seated. It's a great pleasure to welcome Richard Velkley back to Santa Fe. Professor Velkley teaches philosophy at Tulane University in New Orleans, where he's the teacher of numerous former students of St. John Santa Fe. He's author of 3 magnificent and extraordinarily helpful books. First, Freedom and the End of Reason, On the Moral Foundations of Kant's Critical Philosophy. Second, Being After Rousseau. And most recently, Heidegger, Strauss, and the Premises of Philosophy. In these and his other writings, Professor Velkley explores the crisis in reason in modern rational civilization that is confronted first by Rousseau and then all of the great thinkers who come after him. Tonight he is going to talk about Lessing's Laocoön, a work that I just heard Mr. Carey describe as being among the 3 great books which are not on our program. So there's an endorsement. Please welcome Richard Velkley.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Michael. I'm honored to be invited to speak here. It's always a pleasure to be here, to speak with such learned and well-educated company. And I also enjoy Santa Fe, which is one of my favorite cities in the United States. Maybe my second favorite after New Orleans. Now I will turn to this remarkably interesting yet perplexing book. Laocoön, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, is an immensely complex work. A small book made up of short essays. It presents fundamental thoughts in art criticism, poetics, and philosophic inquiry into the nature of the arts. Beneath the surface lie profound ideas about human nature and metaphysics that are suggested rather than proposed in a straightforward argument. Of Lessing's writings, Friedrich Schlegel says that they are a labyrinth, easy to get into and extremely difficult to get out of again. Søren Kierkegaard, one of Lessing's most appreciative readers, associates Lessing with Socrates, who, according to Kierkegaard, planned his entire form of communication artistically so as to be misunderstood. According to Kierkegaard, Lessing too refuses to present a doctrine, as the intent of his work is to make one free. With paradoxical praise, Kierkegaard writes that Lessing lacks seriousness and reliability, as he mingles jest and earnestness, and declines all partnership with the reader. He employs an indirect mode of communication, arousing uncertainty, rather than a direct form seeking agreement. His writing engages in double reflection, as it addresses both the what of the inquiry and the how of communication. Accordingly, Lessing rejects utterances that are world historical and systematic, addressed to all humanity, in the style of Hegel. But the effect of his writing is not merely confusion, since he leads the reader toward insights, albeit this is done mostly without the reader's notice. Johann Goethe, in his autobiography Poetry and Truth, declares that one has to be young to appreciate what an effect Lessing's Laocoön had on us, by lifting us up from the region of miserably limited observation into the wide spaces of thought. But even as Lessing raises one's thoughts to an elevated plane of abstract reflection, in Laocoön, he avows that his thoughts did not come together by a methodical development of general principles, and that, I quote, they are rather unordered collectania for a book than themselves a book. This apparent defect contrasts sharply with a celebrated virtue of many modern writers. For, I quote Lessing, of systematic books there is no lack among us Germans. Out of a few assumed definitions to deduce most logically whatever one will, This we can manage as well as any other nation in the world. Indeed, Lessing allies his apparent disorder of writing to the spirit of the ancients, whose, he says, prerogative in everything is to do neither too much nor too little. We moderns, with our systematic spirit, have considered ourselves their betters when we transform their pleasant little byways into high roads, even if the shorter and safer high roads shrink again to footpaths as they lead us through the wilds. In place of methodical demonstration that extorts agreement, Lessing proceeds with mostly implicit argumentation, especially through the use of examples, which demands the interpretive effort of an attentive reader. Kierkegaard takes note of this as he says, altogether rare as it is these days for any thinker to call the beautiful Greek way of philosophizing to mind by cleverly concentrating himself and his thought existence on something in a single, brief, felicitous statement. Lessing reminds us vividly of the Greeks. Here I wish to put in a word of caution so that we do not rush too quickly and happily to embrace the view of Lessing as an ancient among the moderns, for Lessing makes other statements that have a modern ring about them. Thus he writes that nature has an infinite variety which is comprehensible only by an infinite intellect, and, I quote, in order for finite intellects to participate in the enjoyment of this spectacle, they had to be endowed with an ability to set limits to nature, which nature herself does not possess. I will argue that the problem of setting limits to nature emerges as a major theme in Laocoön. Lessing begins with an account of three standpoints on the arts, those of the amateur, the philosopher, and the critic. The amateur makes the discovery that painting and poetry affect him in a similar manner, in that both present appearance as reality and absent things as present. The arts deceive, and the deceptions are pleasing. The amateur is a person of delicate perception, and although he does not investigate the causes of his pleasure, he notes a crucial common feature of what affords pleasure. It is the philosopher who seeks to penetrate to the source of the pleasure, and finding one source, beauty, derives general rules, first by observing bodies, and then applying them to actions, thoughts, and forms. Whereas the amateur finds a similar pleasure in diverse things, the philosopher uncovers a unitary ground and proceeds with subsuming particulars under it. The critic, the third standpoint, reflects on the philosopher's general rules and sees a need for differentiation. As some rules apply more in painting, others apply more in poetry, even as painting and poetry still illuminate each other. Lessing presents these standpoints as though they form a temporal sequence. First, the amateur discovers the common pleasure. The philosopher then uncovers its ground and establishes rules. Then the critic differentiates in applying the rules. This suggests a natural course of discovery. Although the critic may seem non-philosophic, it is instead the case that criticism follows and corrects, and thus builds upon the previous two standpoints. The critic brings the amateur's observations to a higher level of awareness and turns the philosopher's abstract generalizations into nuanced judgments. This sequence puts Lessing's apparent disorder, his mere collection of thoughts, in a different light. The apparent lack of order masks the real movement of working rigorously through phases of inquiry. And although Lessing seems to disavow an association with the systematic philosopher and his methodical high roads, he is indebted to him. The path of discovery leads through general rules and arrives at disclosing their limitations. At the same time, the critic's procedure is artful and deceptive, for it cultivates the appearance of dilettantish treatment. this essay's discussion of art and poetry is itself artistic and poetic. Good criticism is difficult, Lessing avers, for it involves the just application of feeling and rules to individual cases, wherein many critics go wrong. Lessing focuses on the antithesis of Simonides, that painting is dumb poetry and poetry a vocal painting, which Lessing says was inspired and has some truth. But he laments its transformation into the crude correspondence of painting and poetry in modern critics. The ancients, Lessing claims, were not seduced by the comparison, and while admitting the similarity of the effect of the different arts, they did not omit to point out that they are distinct, both in their subjects and in their manner of imitation. But a modern critical attitude forces each art into the bonds of the other, engendering in poets a rage for description, and in painters a rage for allegorizing. The language of rage, or extreme willfulness, suggests something tyrannical. The idea of tyranny arises in several ways in the course of the essay, and points to an underlying human tendency that embraces the particular phenomena the essay treats explicitly. Lessing's prime example of questionable interpretation is of the famous sculpture of late antiquity depicting Laocoön, the Trojan priest of Neptune, and his two sons, struggling in the lethal coils of two serpents. This work, although not an example of the highest stage of classical sculpture, is the focus of an argument Lessing has with the classical scholar and advocate of the imitation of the Greek ideal, Johann Winckelmann, concerning what is essentially classical. The sculptor of the Laocoön group chose a moment in the story in Virgil's Aeneid of Laocoön's attempt to warn the Trojans of the treacherous gift of the wooden horse that was brought into the gates of the city, for which action the priest is punished by Athena. Lessing is in accord with Winckelmann on the beauty of the work. He cites Winckelmann's aperçu on the noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, famous phrase, edle Einfalt und stille Größe, of the Greek masterpieces. And then Lessing quotes from the author's discussion of the Laocoön group. I quote, "Just as the depths of the sea always remain quiet, however the surface may rage, in like manner, the expression of the figures of the Greek artists show under all passions a great and steadfast soul." Now, Winckelmann says that the pain which is evident throughout Laocoön's body expresses itself in the countenance and in the entire attitude without passion. Unlike the Laocoön in Virgil's Aeneid, the sculpted Laocoön raises no agonizing cry. His mouth opens slightly only to suggest an oppressed, weary sigh. Lessing agrees that the face of Laocoön does not show the passion one would expect, and adds that the constraint of the artist reveals his wisdom. All the same, Lessing believes Winckelmann errs in his account of the reason for this restraint and in the universal rule he deduces from it. Winckelmann's disdain for the Virgilian depiction of the hero's cries reveals a flaw in his conception of heroism and of the Greeks. Lessing notes that the classical poets, Greek and Roman, allow their heroes, and even gods and goddesses, to cry in pain, such that suffering nature may have her rights. And in respect of virtue, and I'm quoting Lessing, Homer raises his heroes above nature, yet they ever remain faithful to her when it comes to the point of feeling pain and injury. Although beyond the human in their deeds, the heroes are in their sensibilities humans. The judgment of Winkelmann betrays a modern European prejudice, for the ancients did not have the modern shame of tears and found no contradiction between fulfilling duty and expressing pain. In Lessing's view, the modern European is the heir of the barbarian, who concealed all fear, grief, and expression of suffering as incompatible with virtue, and whose bravery, raging continually, consumed every other good quality. The restraint of the Laocoön sculpture cannot be due to the reason Winkelmann advances. Yet Winkelmann briefly notes that the ancient world saw the appearance of something akin to the barbaric attitude in Stoicism, which is an attitude unsuitable for the theater since the drama calls for the evocation of pity. Lessing here hints at a connection between the rise of Stoicism and the decline of the public art of the drama, which went along with the decline of political liberty. There is a link between the free display of pain and political freedom. But if tyranny is related to barbarism and suppression of feeling, it is more subtly linked to beauty and to the restraint that is deemed essential to its expression. This consideration, with political overtones, is the next step in Lessing's thought on the Laocoön group. Modern painters exercise wide latitude in their art's subject matter as they imitate bodies on a plane surface, but the wise Greek, who Lessing says was following the prompting of Eros, limited the subject of plastic arts to the imitation of beautiful bodies. As the beautiful body was regarded as the perfection of beauty, this subject matter and its manner of treatment were so highly prized that laws existed to keep artists bound to their proper sphere. It was not merely the bungler who fell under penalty, but also the skillful artist who dared to exaggerate a less attractive aspect of the model. Lessing says that moderns will laugh when they hear that the ancients subjected the arts to municipal laws. But they fail to note that the law pertained to what gives pleasure, and that pleasure influences character. The plastic arts in particular exert this influence, and lawgivers perceived that beautiful statues have the effect of producing beautiful citizens. Lessing implies that laws of beauty that concern the character of the nation are not tyrannical, whereas laws that usurp power over the sciences, whose purpose is truth, a necessity of the soul, are tyrannical in their violence to nature. But Lessing subtly indicates that legislation of imitation that requires exclusion of truthful representation of the ugly is at odds with the need for truth, and that there is a tension between two competing goods, the demand of the city for formation of character and the need of the soul for truth. In light of this reflection, the Laocoön sculptural group is rich in significance, for Laocoön is a truth-teller who is punished by a goddess who seeks to defend her beloved Greeks from the consequences of this truthfulness. It is remarkable that a work of plastic art, whose prime concern is the presentation of beauty, should portray in an allegory the punishment of truth-telling that threatens the victory of the particular people, the Greeks, who embody, above all others, the beautiful. And this representation is far from being wholly beautiful, for the terror of the serpents is an element of ugliness that is indispensable to the story of the punishment of the truth-teller. When Winkelmann and Lessing speak of the beauty of the sculpture, they focus on the priest, and in particular his facial expression, and ignore the serpents. In an odd paragraph that follows this account of truth and laws of imitation, Lessing seems to correct his own abstraction from the serpents. He provides some references to ancient legends that pregnant women who gave birth to heroes after they looked at beautiful statues, at figures such as Bacchus, Apollo, Mercury, which were usually adorned with serpents, had dreams in which the serpent figured. Lessing says that he rejects the modern account of these dreams. I quote, "There must certainly be a reason why the adulteress of fantasy was never anything but a serpent." Does not Lessing humorously suggest that it was something other than the images of the beautiful gods that affected the mental and emotional state of the bearers of the city's heroes? Is he not suggesting that the city's laws exaggerate the role that the beautiful images have in producing beautiful citizens? The truth is that in the life of the city and its citizens, serpents of all kinds loom large. Now one can ask how the two errors are related. First, Winkelmann's not seeing that classical poetry fittingly admits direct expression of feelings, of pain. And second, modern perplexity over imitation of beautiful bodies being regulated under penalty of law due to its special character. In the first case, Winkelmann misses the full humanity of the Greeks and Romans, imposing an abstract ideal of tranquil virtue on all things ancients. In the second case, moderns overlook the problem of the relation of theorizing or the search for truth to practical life or the realm of opinion. What links these errors is the spirit of abstract systematizing that misses the complexity of the human. This spirit is tyrannical, or has a tyrannical tendency, for it does not recognize that virtuous character has the rights of suffering nature, as Lessing puts it, and it rides recklessly over the delicate tension between the ethos of beauty and that of free inquiry. Lessing's observation on these features of the classical world prepare the way for the distinction for which the Laocoön essay is best known, the distinction between the media of the plastic and poetic arts, and how the different media are related to differences in subject matter and manner of representation. The distinction of media is between the art of bodily, that is, 2- or 3-dimensional representation, which must limit its imitative effort to a single moment, and the art of linguistic imitation of action, which has no temporal restriction. The plastic artists must choose for imitation a single moment with utmost discretion, for that moment has an unchanging continuance, and if it is an extreme state, the imitation gives an unrelieved, painful impression. The work of sculpture is made, as Lessing says, not merely to be seen, but to be considered, to be long and repeatedly contemplated. The epic or dramatic poet, by contrast, can represent an extreme state as a moment in a sequence of moments, and its effect is muted by the imitation of other, less painful states that surround it. The extreme states are by their nature transitory, or at least they must be thought as such, and to eternalize them in an image induces loathing. The plastic artists are forced by their medium to concentrate on bodily beauty in a way that does not hold for poets. Accordingly, the moment chosen by the plastic artist cannot be the supreme moment of an action, but rather a moment suggestive of the supreme moment. The sculptor of Laocoön did not depict the ultimate death throes of the hero, but rather a moment of struggle that is pregnant with the inevitable outcome. But Lessing gives another reason for avoiding visual depiction of the final ruination, which seems quite different. I quote the passage. "It is certain that the single moment can never be chosen too significantly. Now that alone is significant and fruitful, which gives free play to the imagination. The more we see, the more must we be able to add by thinking. The more we add thereto by thinking, so much the more can we believe ourselves to see. In the whole gamut of emotion, however, there is no moment less advantageous than its topmost note. Beyond it, there's nothing further. And to show us the uttermost is to tie the wings of fancy and compel her, as she cannot rise above the sensuous impression, to busy herself with weaker pictures below it. End of the quotation. This seems to be a different consideration from the first, which was the avoidance of an unbearably painful image that offers no relief. It seemed before as though what one wants from the sculpture is to rest in contemplation of a beautiful image. Now, according to Lessing, the point is that the imagination rebels against the compulsion to stop in a single moment and wants the freedom to think beyond it. It cannot accept finality at all, not just a painful finality. At this point, one should recall the opening description of the amateur, who takes pleasure in the representation of appearance as reality and absent things as present. The mind enjoys not only the contemplation of the present image, but the presentation of the absent through what is present. The image is not fully enjoyable if it does not suggest what lies beyond the present. The free play of the imagination is the play with the absent as well as the present. If constrained to regard only the present, the mind is denied its freedom or subjected to the tyranny of the present against its nature. One could say, however, that Lessing is suggesting that the two needs of the spectator are not exclusive, but they are in fruitful tension. To rest in contemplation of the present beautiful image is a need that is opposed at the same time by a need to imagine freely beyond the present. It is not the case that through the beautiful work of art, one can satisfy only one of the two needs at a time, at the expense of the other, but that both needs are satisfied and that the tension between them is an essential part of the pleasure. I believe that the entire essay is a reflection on these two needs and what it means for human beings to have them. As a digression, but a useful one, it is worth noting that there is a related reflection in Kant's account of the judgment of beauty, more than 20 years after Laocoön, in which he describes the free play of the imagination with forms judged to be beautiful, and writes of a combination of lawfulness and free association as central to the pleasure in the judging. But I would maintain that in Lessing's view, the demand for beautiful form has something tyrannical about it, all the same. And the human mind has a need for this tyranny, even as it also has a need to transgress this tyrannical rule. The accomplished artist has an understanding of this, even if it is not articulated theoretically. Nevertheless, there is also a human tendency to miss this complexity, and thus for lawgivers, pseudo-philosophers, and bad critics, simply to take the side of contemplation of the present beautiful form, and to regard it as wholly satisfying. For they, in effect, treat the beautiful only in its relation to law, or to the formation and ruling of the human. If I understand Lessing correctly, the problem is not that the city or law dictates what is beautiful, but that beauty, the city, and law are all results of the human need to place limits on nature. But just as humans must set such limits, they must also transgress them, at least in thought. The arts offer the enjoyments of transgression, even as they also provide a pleasing sense of order. Turning from Velkley on ancient sculpture to certain modern critics on painting, Lessing notes that they assume that visual art is capable of treating all subjects of poetry. Art in these later days has been assigned far wider boundaries. Let her imitative hand, folks say, stretch out to the whole of visible nature, of which the beautiful is only a small part. Let fidelity and truth of expression be her first law. And as nature herself at all times sacrifices beauty to higher purposes, so must the artist subordinate it to his general aim and yield it no further than fidelity of expression permits. And so there's a contrast at work. If Winkelmann would constrain poetry by the standard of beauty in sculpture, these modern critics of painting would expand painting's range by the standard of expression in poetry. Lessing proceeds to expound on the greater freedom of poetry. He says, nothing requires the poet to concentrate his picture on one single moment. He takes up each of his actions as he likes from its very origin and conducts it through all possible modifications to its final close. Every one of these modifications, which would cost the artist an entire separate canvas or marble block, costs the poet a single line. Lessing says that a modern English critic, Joseph Spence, appears to have no notion, and I quote Lessing, that poetry is the more comprehensive art, that beauties are at her command which painting can never attain, that she may frequently have reason to prefer unpicturesque beauties to picturesque. Indeed, Lessing claims that the poet alone can make the ugly pleasing. For, I quote, to the poet alone belongs the art of depicting with negative truths, and by mixing them with positive to bring two images into one. And more strikingly, he writes of Homer's freedom to make the invisible present, invoking again the free play of imagination. I quote, when at last the divided gods came to blows among themselves over the fate of the Trojans, the whole struggle passes with the poet invisibly, and this invisibility permits the imagination to enlarge the stage and leaves it free play to conceive the persons of the gods and their actions as great and as elevated as far above common humanity as ever it pleases. But painting must assume a visible stage, the various necessary parts of which become the scale for the persons acting on it, a scale which the eye has immediately before it. Lessing seems to regard poetry as having no limits to expression, but this impression is corrected when he announces that he will turn to the foundations and try to argue the matter from first principles. At this point, Lessing sounds like a systematic philosopher. He notes that painting and poetry employ quite different signs in their imitations. Figures and colors in space, in the one case, articulate sounds in time in the other, and these different signs are suited for expressing different subject matters. Signs arranged together side by side can express only subjects whose parts exist thus side by side, and signs which succeed each other can express only subjects whose parts succeed each other. Subjects whose parts exist side by side may be called bodies, and these with their visible properties form the proper subjects of painting. Subjects whose various parts succeed each other may in general be called actions, and these form the proper subjects of poetry. But immediately there is an important acknowledgement of interdependence between bodies and actions. For Lessing says, all bodies exist not in space alone, but also in time. In the painting of sculptures, one beholds a momentary appearance that stands in relation to other momentary appearances that precede and follow. And the depicted moment lies within an action. Thus, visual arts can imitate actions, but only by way of suggestion through bodies. This thought was already raised in the account of the sculptor's choice of the fruitful moment. But now Lessing makes a symmetrical point about a limitation of poetic art. For, he says, actions cannot subsist for themselves, but must attach to certain things or persons. Insofar as these things are bodies or are regarded as bodies, poetry too depicts bodies. but only by way of suggestion through actions. Both arts, in other words, address a common realm, that of bodily beings in action, but their differing media, spatial signs and temporal signs, allow them to depict directly only one aspect of the whole phenomenon and compel them to suggest the other aspect. To put this in other words, the humanly available means of imitation compel the visual artist and the poet to perform different abstractions from the whole phenomenon of bodies in action. At the same time, the abstractions must point toward what they fail to present directly, or what is present through signs must point to what is absent. If this were not done, and bodies were presented without relation to actions, and actions presented without relation to bodies, then both bodies and actions thus imitated would be unintelligible. This reflection brings forward the question whether one might not be in the happiest position with an art that combines visual images and poetry, and presents thereby directly the whole phenomenon of bodies in action. Of course, the staged performance of dramatic art comes to mind. But the expressive power of drama does not alter the reality that poetic language and visual images each have limits to their representative power. As for poetry, it can use in its continuous imitations, I quote, only one single property of bodies, and therefore must choose the one which calls up the most living picture of the body on that side from which the poet regards it. Here we find the origin of the rule which insists on the unity and consistency of descriptive epithets and on economy in the delineations of bodily subjects. Lessing adduces the example of Homer, whose practice contrasts strongly with the tendency of modern poets to emulate painters. Lessing says, Homer paints nothing but continuous actions, but all bodies, all single things, he paints only by their share in those actions, and in general only by one feature. A ship is to him now the black ship, now the hollow ship, now the swift ship, at most the well-rowed black ship. Beyond that he does not enter on a picture of the ship. Lessing notes that Homer sometimes dwells on a single corporeal object, but he presents it in a succession of moments in which it assumes different appearances, and the image that the painter could imitate arises only at the end, after the poet has run through all the appearances. Lessing takes up a famous example shortly. Looking at the comparison of arts and their media from at a distance, one is tempted to propose a metaphysical observation. Although Lessing holds back from stating this directly, I would say he suggests it. The spatial arts that use coexisting signs are more closely related to body, and this Lessing says. The temporal arts that use successive signs are more closely related to actions. Lessing says this too. But the successive signs of temporal arts are linguistic, and language in conveying action is performing an action. The primary action of language is to convey thought, as the actions it conveys are not present in body, but only in thought. Action itself is not simply a bodily reality, but exists crucially in the thought of the actor and in the thought of observers. In the linguistic expression of thought, one can make present many things that are not presentable in visual images. Moving beyond actions, one can deal with entirely invisible and abstract things. In the first place, gods, as Lessing notes, but also abstract discourse about things divine, natural, and human. One can sum this up and take it a bit further. Humans have different capacities for knowing, and some capacities are better suited for apprehending bodies, others for apprehending action and thought. Remarkably, there is no human power of knowing able to make things fully present in their wholeness. This suggests that the human experience of bodies is not strictly in harmony with the human experience of thoughts and actions. It is interesting at this point to ask why Lessing does not directly state all the conclusions that seem to follow from his observations. An answer comes from Lessing's own words about the good poet and the good critic, for these apply to Lessing, the critic, philosopher, poet. The good poet and good critic do not attempt to say everything directly. Indeed, every writer who thinks seriously about writing must realize that the effort to give an account of anything is necessarily by way of abstractions. And the best writer will try to suggest what is left out of the abstractions through a deft use of language. In Lessing's terms, this means to allow freedom to the imagination, and accordingly not to be a tyrant who tries to say everything in a completed doctrine. Although Lessing in this passage on signs come close to sounding like a systematic thinker, he still leaves much unsaid. Soon after introducing his foundations, Lessing responds to an objector that the poet can use linguistic signs that succeed one another in time to represent spatially figures whose parts are side by side. The tradition has a name for such representation, ekphrosis. It can be done because linguistic signs are arbitrary signs, and as such they are not limited in their capacities, as are figures, shapes, and colors. They can be interpreted, therefore, as representations of side-by-side figures. Lessing illustrates this by an account of the famous passage in Iliad 18 that describes the shield that Vulcan, or Hephaestus, made for the hero Achilles. The description is over 100 lines in an elaborate representation of city life and pastoral life with indication of cosmological ideas, as these are imitated on the shield. Lessing says, we have only to remember the shield of Achilles in order to have the most decisive example in how detailed and yet poetical a manner some single thing can be depicted with various parts side by side. What is more, Homer describes the shield in his characteristic way of giving this a sense of continuous action, and not simply as a representation of a static thing. As Lessing puts it, the poet is not concerned merely to be intelligible. His representation should not merely be clear and plain, though this may satisfy the prose writer. He desires rather to make the ideas awakened by him within us living things, so that for the moment we realize the true sensuous impression of the object he describes, and cease, in the moment of illusion, to be conscious of the means, namely his words, which he employs for his purpose. This is the substance of what we have already said of the poetic picture. But the poet should always paint. End of quotation. So for Lessing, the poet does indeed paint in a special way, namely that of temporal succession. This analysis of Homer's shield brings forth the question that arose early in the essay of how poetry might be different from science, and how poetry's concern might differ from the concern with truth. Now, Lessing says that poetry does not just seek to make things clear, plain, and intelligible, but with awakening ideas within us as living beings. Poetry should make present to us sensual impressions which have the illusory effect of reality. Lessing characterizes how Homer's accomplishment of this contrasts with the visual representation in the plastic arts. In the visual work of art, the observer takes in all the parts rapidly. They are regarded singly and then in combination as a whole. These operations are performed, Lessing says, with so astonishing a swiftness that they seem to us but one, and this swiftness is imperatively necessary if we are to arrive at a conception of the whole, which is nothing more than the result of the conception of the parts and their combination. End of quotation. The poet is imitating a spatial figure, must do something comparable, moving from one part to another. But the time taken for this is different with the poem. I quote Lessing, "What the eye sees at a glance, the poet counts out to us gradually, with a perceptible slowness. And often it happens that when we come to the last figure, we have already forgotten the first. Nevertheless, we have to frame a whole from these features to the eye. We have to frame a whole from those features, colon. To the eye, the parts beheld remain constantly present, and it cannot run over them again and again. For the ear, on the contrary, the parts heard are lost if they do not abide in the memory. And if they so abide, what trouble, what effort it costs to renew the impressions, all of them in due order, so vividly, to think of them together with even a moderate swiftness, and thus to arrive at an eventual conception of the whole. Now, Lessing points out that the poetic movement through a complex whole with many parts that coexist can fail to be effective. Such as the description of the Alps by the poet von Haller. Lessing says, "Here are weeds and flowers which the learned poet paints with much art and fidelity to nature. Paints, but without any illusion whatever. It remains infinitely below that which lines and colors on canvas can express. And the critic who bestows on it this exaggerated praise must have regarded it from an utterly false point of view." End of quotation. The linkage of blossoms, stems, twigs, and so forth. Of this Lessing claims that it can hardly compare with the representation by a Dutch painter Huyssen. In von Haller, Lessing hears in every word the toiling poet, and I am far enough from seeing the thing itself. This comparison of Homer and von Haller brings out the challenge the poet confronts, namely to convey a certain vivid effect of wholeness, while moving through a continuous series of parts, and to do so in a way. Did this go off? Oh. All right. I'm losing vividness, at least in myself. Okay. All right, the challenge of the poet is to convey a certain vivid effect of wholeness while moving through a continuous series of parts, and to do so in a way that is engaging. This is difficult for the poet because the whole is more elusive than it is in visual art, because the whole has to emerge from our active reconstruction, from a movement of thought through the parts. Homer's solution to the part-whole problem is characteristically Homeric, namely that of not burdening the parts with much description. And moreover, Homer presents the shield as though it is being produced as a being made by Vulcan, a work in progress, emerging through an artificer. In other words, what would otherwise be just spatial becomes a continuous action. It has the quality of action, the action of being made. But why must poetry resort to this? The point seems to be that poetry is not just concerned with intelligibility, because a thorough description, a kind of catalog, would achieve this end. Poetry is not concerned solely with truth, but it is also the case that it has a greater range of possible subjects than visual art, and that poetry does not limit itself to presenting the beautiful. However, it is concerned with the illusion of presence, of making a whole seem to be a living thing, and therefore it must move through the parts so that the whole is alive. The whole must have a certain vividness of presence and not be merely the summation of parts. Not something one has gone through by being attentive to the various parts, which one could do in a treatise or a catalog or some prose writing. Instead, Lessing states in the preface, which we heard, in poetry, the concern is with appearance as reality and with the absent being made present. Painting and sculpture make immediately present the given body or group of figures, and poetry tries to make immediately present an action or a series of actions or temporal events that belong to things. But actions are less amenable to being presented as whole. To the actors themselves, they have anticipated outcomes that depend on factors beyond human control. All action begins in the vivid present and fades into the indeterminate future, into absence. Whereas actions depicted by poets are completed wholes with determinate outcomes, their representation unfolds in time, and for the reader or listener, this has a sense of indeterminacy as the story unfolds. Lessing claims that Virgil, in his description of the shield of Aeneas, didn't succeed in achieving poetic illusion of presence. That is, he characterizes Virgil as not proceeding in a genuinely poetic way, more in the way of a cataloger, as someone, as he puts it, is more like a courtier attempting to impress his patrons with his knowledge of heraldry, knowledge of the elaborate insignia on shields. Homer, by contrast, produces a shield that is the natural outgrowth of the fertile soil, Lessing says. This sounds like a romantic characterization of this shield, as autochthonic. But Lessing corrects this by stressing how the shield is an artifact, yet one produced in a way analogous to the growth of a living being. It is something made by the poet, but by a poet who has the ability to generate an artifact in a natural way, rather than to produce mechanically. Of the two shield descriptions, Lessing says, and I quote a paragraph, "The shield of Aeneas is consequently a sheer interpolation, simply and only intended to flatter the national pride of the Romans, a foreign tributary which the poet leads into his main stream in order to give it a livelier motion. The shield of Achilles, on the other hand, is a rich natural outgrowth of the fertile soil from which it springs. For a shield had to be made, and as the needful thing never comes bare and without grace from the hands of the divinity, the shield also had to be embellished. But the art was to treat these embellishments merely as such, to enweave them into the stuff, in order to show them to us only by means of the latter. And this can only be done by Homer's method. Homer lets Vulcan elaborate ornaments because he is to make a shield that is worthy of himself. Virgil, on the other hand, appears to let him make the shield for the sake of its ornaments, considering them important enough to be particularly described after the shield itself has long been finished. Lessing broaches here a theme important in later writers on art and aesthetics. Productions by poetic genius are compared to living nature or organism. Lessing seems to be stressing that poetry and visual art convey in their own ways the sense of the present of wholeness, which is an illusory sense of the vital presence. And this is something that is not available or comes not easily to science and philosophy. So it would take a poetic form of philosophy to do something comparable. Perhaps Lessing might consider the Platonic dialogues as a candidate for that. In other words, even the philosophic writing that is concerned with the truth also entails abstraction, and therefore is confronting the fact that it must exist in a realm of partiality or falsity. The different forms of art create these illusory senses of the presence of wholeness, and each does so with a certain limitation, confronted with a tendency toward a certain abstraction. The visual art can make immediately present the wholeness of a visual figure, but it does not make immediately present the wholeness of action, which belongs to the realm of the suggested. Conversely, the poetic imitation can convey the immediate presence of temporal events, the moments of action. But what is more difficult for it is to convey the wholeness of the action, which includes the presence of agents. To summarize, what is very difficult to do in all the arts is to bring together as vividly present, as a form of immediate presence, the wholeness of beings, bodies, and figures, and the wholeness of actions. One could say that if these could be brought together, it would constitute intuitive knowledge. Perhaps this is what the Aesopic fable, a subject of great interest to Lessing, approaches. because it uses figure in a relatively simple way, but it conveys on a more abstract level a teaching or rule concerning action. It thus offers some experience of how action makes sense or forms a whole. Now, having considered these strengths and limitations of the arts, it might be timely to return to the earlier moral observations concerning how painting and sculpture are more closely tied to custom and to law than poetry. Because the primary emphasis in visual art is on beauty, one must ask, what is beauty? Focusing on the pleasure of the beautiful, one sees that beauty is the immediate presence of something whose parts form a whole. The figure or the group of figures is something the eye can take in rather easily and quickly as a whole. Now, Lessing said that the cities of Greece had a certain concern with rules or laws concerning the production of art with an eye to maintaining standards of beauty. But why should there be a closer tie between the way visual art makes wholes present to us and law or custom? I offer a hypothesis. It is characteristic of political life or the realm of law and custom that some form of wholeness must be immediately present. In other words, it is the interest of a city, which demands full allegiance of its citizens, that the citizens be not left to themselves to search for a whole. The laws, with their divine sanction, define the whole for the citizens. But for the poetic art, even with a brilliant poet like Homer, who goes through a complex series of actions to convey a whole, as the shield example illustrates, the whole is still, nevertheless, only an accomplishment. As unfolding a time, it cannot be immediately present. The whole that poetry presents is not concerned solely with the beautiful. It is tolerant of a kind of complexity of parts, which can even be discordant or at odds with one another. From this perspective, one can see why there would be a tendency for political life to be more attentive to the less problematic kinds of wholeness. Political life would tend to stress beauty and to favor it, to make sure that there are laws that maintain it, because it is concerned with forming a kind of wholeness in its citizens. And as I have said, with respect to the human need for truth, there is an element of the tyrannical in this. Of course, the spirit of Greece cannot be described as simply tyrannical. For one thing, it is clear that the age of the flourishing of the arts in Greece, Athens in particular, is a flourishing of poetry as much as plastic arts, with tragedies and comedies presenting more complex forms of wholeness alongside the beautiful wholes of sculpture. And this is not to mention the works of the philosophers. On that point, Lessing has one reference to poetic writing about a philosopher. This occurs in the rather strange concluding chapters of the essay, which treat the ugly, the laughable, and the disgusting. Lessing gives examples of how the disgusting is able to enhance the laughable. The prime example, significantly, is from Aristophanes' Clouds, where the subject is Socrates, who is the object of Aristophanes' mockery. In a passage Lessing quotes from the play, a student of Socrates describes Socrates as having an unpleasant encounter with a lizard. The student is speaking to Strepsiades, an angry parent, who has accused Socrates of being a troublemaker and a corrupter of the youth. Note, once again we see a serpent attacking a truth-teller or truth-seeker. And I quote the lines that Lessing has from the play. Student, and yet last night a mighty thought we lost through a green lizard. Strepsiades, well, tell me, how was that? Student, why, as he himself, Socrates, with eyes and mouth wide open, mused on the moon, her paths and revolutions, a lizard from the roof squirted full on him. Strepsiades, he. I like the lizard spattering Socrates. Why is the prime example of the laughable and disgusting taken from a text that is humbling a philosopher? Is Lessing's purpose only to show the poetic humbling of philosophy, or also to suggest that the poetic and comic treatment of philosophy is itself something akin to philosophy. Strikingly, in none of the other writings or works of arts treated in the essay is philosophy itself a subject or directly pointed toward. Perhaps a more philosophic spirit exists in comedy, with its mixing of the disgusting and the laughable, than in any of the other forms of art Lessing examines. Its freedom, one might say, is most removed from the tyranny of beauty. Thank you.